One to a new webinar of the Institute for Latin American Studies on COVID-19 in Latin America. We are going to talk about science and policy making today, and we have the pleasure of having with us Pilar Fernandez, who's a biologist and a postdoctoral researcher at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. She works on disease ecologies and zoonotic diseases and socio-ecological systems. She will talk first about the origin of coronavirus and other zoonotic diseases. And then we will have Rodrigo Soares, who is the Lemann Professor of Brazilian Public Policy and International Affairs at CIPA, the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. He's an economist who worked on development economics and policy making, and among other areas in the area of health. And so this is a great conversation. I'm very, very thankful to both of you for having agreed to come to this Zoom, and also to everyone who's attending for hearing us. Please use the chat function for questions. I will be taking the questions from the chat function after the two speakers finish their brief presentations, and I will be making the questions to them to avoid any this problem with bomb zooming or distraction in the Zoom. Thank you very much to all of you.
Well, thank you, everybody. I'm Pilar Fernandez. So I'm gonna share my screen really quickly, since I have a short presentation. So I believe we have a very diverse audience. So I'm gonna talk about a little bit about emerging zoonotic diseases, which are the diseases that are shared between humans and animals, which is the case of coronavirus, which jump from an animal host into humans. And this is very different from just emerging infectious diseases. Emerging infectious diseases are very broad, and most of them are related to antimicrobial resistance, which is a different phenomenon. Zoonotic diseases are a little bit more complex to study because it involves not just humans, but also what is happening in the natural transmission cycles that they usually have. So I'm an ecologist, and I've been working on zoonotic diseases for a long time, not related to coronaviruses, but basically we can talk about the same processes happening. So we have, when we are talking about, sorry, I need to be able to see my screen a little bit, but here's a figure from a very interested paper. You have the citation there, but basically we have different processes. We have that happens and determine whether a disease that is circulating between animal hosts in nature, it's going to be transmitted to humans and can cause disease in humans and be established as a just one-time event, or that it's a recurring event. So it basically involves what is happening in the hosts, the reservoir hosts, which we call all the animals that have this pathogen circulating, and the probability of those pathogens to jump into people. And that's has to do with the capacity of the pathogen to jump and infect people, but also have people get exposed to this diseases. So there are many things that need to happen for a spillover event. And a spillover event, we mentioned when a pathogen that is circulating between animal hosts are able to infect human and cause an outbreak, for example. So there are different layers that we need to study, and this figure shows it very well, that everything needs to be aligned. All the processes need to be aligned for that event to happen. And you have here, when it says disease ecology, animal epidemiology, that's the area where I specialize and where we're studying as ecologists and disease ecologists. We're trying to understand what's the pathogen prevalence, the infection intensity, and how can this pathogen be transmitted between other animal hosts, or how is it maintained in nature. By combining this with all the human dimension of disease and how people are exposing themselves to these pathogens are in the wild, we can understand better how that event, what's the probability of that event of happening. So it's not just knowing what is happening in nature, but also how humans relate to nature. And so there's a lot of been a discussion in our field about what's the relationship between biodiversity and the spillover events and this emerging diseases of happening. So it's a actually very complex question, and the answer is that it really depends. Depends on the system that we're talking about. It depends at which scale we're thinking about. And this stems from, if we look at the big picture, the global picture, and we see where this emerging zoonotic diseases are happening, you can relate it to areas where we have more biodiversity. For example, Ebola viruses, or areas where, like for example, in Africa or Southeast Asia, where we expect the biodiversity might be higher. That's not necessarily the case for the Amazon, for example. So it's not that of a trivial thing to answer. And I wanted to point you to this paper by Hosseini et al., where they distinguish between the hazard and the risk of emergence. Hazard is basically everything that can create a harm to people. So in some cases, more biodiversity can create more hazard because there might be more of this pathogen circulating. But also the risk is related to how anthropogenic change or how humans get exposed to these viruses. So in some cases, for example, Lyme disease, biodiversity might be able to protect us from getting diseases or from like these events to happen. Just because we have what we call diluting hosts, which are not susceptible to the disease, but they kind of dilute the disease. So it's not such a easy question to answer, but I'm not going to go in for the sake of time, or I'm not going to go much into it. So there's, for example, here at the UN, I love this picture because it shows all the other things that we as humans might be able to do to increase this events from happening. For example, deforestation and other land use changes, intensified agriculture, which brings a lot of these animals and together and might increase, and together humans can increase the probability of these events of happening. For example, this is the case of the bird flu. One of the, it's been a lot of the talk with COVID-19 is wildlife trafficking, that it's a worldwide problem. The wet markets are not just something that happened in China. And then obviously we have climate change and antimicrobial resistance related to, for example, cattle. So spillover effects, basically you can have, so from the wild into areas and villages where people work, and then you have all the human activities, domestic animals, that can be a link between also the wild and the human environment, at the same as cattle, and how people do husbandry practices. So in this case, talking about COVID-19, there's been a lot of discussion on bats, and why are they important, and they seem to be so important for surveillance. It's like, well, these bats, they actually live pretty long compared to other, for example, rodents, and so that creates a lot of probability of them to get infected from other animals, and they live aggregated in large colonies, which facilitates pathogen transmissions between them. Also, there's certain things about their coevolution with pathogens in bats that have been really important for that, for creating this importance as reservoirs of emerging viruses. Not just coronaviruses, but from the family of Ebola viruses as well. So they have some attenuated immune response that basically allows them to have large viral loads and large viral diversity within them without being really affected. So that brings me to SARS Classic, which is basically, it occurred an outbreak in 2003, 2004, which is the pathogen that is more related to SARS-CoV-2, which is the one that it's caused COVID-19. So in SARS Classic, we had the bats that for environmental disturbance were able to infect civets, which is this animal here, which is very cute. Some genetic recombination occurred there between in the coronavirus that allowed these animals to get infected, and then also pass the infections to humans when they get in contact. And then what is challenging about these viruses is that they acquire the ability to be transmitted from humans to human. And that's when it's a problem to think about pandemics. If we have zoonotic diseases, which we have a lot of them, but they don't have the probability of jumping from human to human, then they usually are restricted. They make very restricted outbreaks in the areas where humans can be exposed to this, especially when they become airborne. And that's the probability of transmission is higher between humans. And we have another coronavirus that emerged in 2012 in the Middle East, which is MERS. And it's a little bit different. So SARS Classic, we had an outbreak in 2003, 2004, and then we haven't had any cases since then. So it was just one event. Here with MERS, what happened is the same situation. So, there was an interaction between bats and camels. Camels became reservoirs, which means they have circulating this new coronavirus. And because of the stretch contact between camels and humans in the Middle East, it jumped from camels to humans, and then it acquired the ability to jump from human to human. We still have cases of MERS because we still have reservoir. It was not just we have, and then we can have multiple spillover events happening. So it brings me to what the PREDICT project, I don't know if you heard about it, but basically this project, I'm not, just a disclaimer, I'm not involved with PREDICT, but I know a lot of people that are, and it involves a lot of institutions, and it was funded by the Agency of International Development and the Emerging Pandemic Threats Program. Basically, what they're trying to do, they have 4 projects: predict, respond, identify, and prevent. And the predict section is to identify new emerging diseases before they can actually jump into people. So what they do is they locate with local partners in areas where we know that there are chances of having spillovers, and they just do some surveillance of animals. So they take samples from bats, rodents, and other non-human primates, and they try to sequence all the viruses that are circulating between them. Oh, I just missed one slide, but basically this project is mostly focused on Southeast Asia, Asia, Middle East, and Africa. In several countries, we have no, the PREDICT is not working in Latin America. There are some groups though working on emerging infectious diseases in Latin America, and do we have them? Yes. I guess one of the ones that I wanted to point them, and we have several examples of zoonotic diseases and emerging diseases happening in recent decades or even tracing back. One that I wanted to point to is Hantavirus, for example, caused by Andes virus, which was going around. We had a couple of outbreaks last year due to the increase of the rodent population in Patagonia. And why is this, I wanted to point it to this, is because this actually had, there's some evidence that was actually, there was some human-to-human transmission. It was airborne. So that's something that we want to keep an eye on. The thing in Latin America is that usually it's very urbanized continent. So human exposure, it's lower compared to, for example, Southeast Asia. Still, we do have these things happening, and there could be an outbreaks, but we need to do a lot more surveillance. Other examples are vector-borne diseases that have been linked to some degree of environmental changes, rodent-related viruses that can create hemorrhagic fevers, and then others like rabies, for example. So just three things that we need to think about in Latin America is where are we in terms of capacity building and basically surveillance, and if that is linked to response preparedness, and also understand more about the as there are groups working on this. The problem that we have in Latin America compared to other regions is that these events are not coordinated. So with this, I wanted to pass it on. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I hope I didn't talk too long. Sorry if I went over, but I think I wanted to present the whole picture.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. I guess it's your turn. This was fascinating, and given the failures of advanced countries, it seems hard to think of how Latin America will fare, but we'll listen to Rodrigo to talk about policymaking and science now.
Thank you, Vicky. Thank you for the invitation and for organizing this, and thank you, Pilar, as well for her talk. So following Vicky's guidelines, I'm going to try to talk about like the relationship between science, data, information, and policy making at this time, right? At the time of the epidemic. I think I want to organize this brief introduction. I think I want to frame the discussion in kind of three more or less chronological stages. One is like the initial context of expansion of the coronavirus, then where we stand right now, so the current setting, and then the road ahead. Right? And I think there are different considerations related to this broad topic that are relevant in each one of these settings. Right? So to start with the initial context, and I think this is also relevant for us to understand the actual expansion of the epidemic. I think we already knew that before, but I think now it's much more salient that the arrival of the coronavirus actually took place within a political setting that has been largely dominated for a reasonable amount of time, and I guess all over the world, for a deep erosion in government trust, and I also think in trust in technocracies, generally speaking, and even more trust on established knowledge, trust on expertise, right, of any sort, right? I think we traditionally associate these with the rise of this new populist right wing, but I do think it's a little deeper and more generalized than that. And I think it did represent an important factor in determining the response of different countries to the current crisis, right? But I think this took place, as I mentioned before, along different kind of political, different positions in the political spectrum. So I think I saw clear failures in response in Spain, in the UK, in Sweden, in Brazil, in Mexico. These are actually countries with very different state capacities. These are countries with very different ideologies in government, and still all of them in different ways, to some extent, disregard, or in some cases at least, parts of the federal government try to disregard what is considered accepted knowledge, right? Most dramatically, I think, at least up to now in terms of actual consequences, most dramatically, I think this actually happened in the US at an extent, given the state capacity typically associated with the country, that is really without precedent. I think we cannot exaggerate the Trump effect on the coronavirus epidemic in the US. I really think it's not a stretch to imagine that reactions could have been very different under another president, either Republican or Democrat. and probably also with radically different outcomes. So the US is a strong candidate to be, after everything is over, even to be potentially, at least among the reasonably developed countries, let's say, to be probably the worst scenario worldwide. I don't think that's inconceivable if we take out like the extreme poor countries, right? There is still a lot of information to be revealed, but I don't think that's inconceivable at this stage. I think the problem of lack of trust in expertise in science and in technocracy, let's say, I think it was enhanced in the case of the coronavirus in particular because of some characteristics of the virus itself, right? Two of them meaning the very long incubation period, or the potentially very long incubation period. That's not always the case. And also the fact that sometimes you have asymptomatic carriers that also can contaminate people. What this means in the end is that it's in the first few weeks when the problem is just coming up, it's very difficult to see clear signs, right? And even more to see clear signs of the seriousness of the problem, right? And I think this delayed reaction a little bit exactly because people couldn't see that, right? And that's more or less what took us to the current setting, right? So the current setting, everybody knows, I think it's, I don't have to say, the virus is all over the world now. In some regions, the worst phases, the most dramatic phases of the epidemic have already gone away. In other places, we are just like here, we just really getting to the top. And other places are still in early stages. I would probably include Latin America still in an early stage, made a transition from an early stage to a stage of growth, right? So since this came about a couple of months ago, we learned a couple of things. I mean, certainly at a very high cost, but we did learn a couple of things. So I think there is some data. So I'm calling this data. One is that obviously the virus is super contagious, very highly contagious. For most people, it has very mild consequences, if any at all. But actually, it can be very extremely dangerous for specific groups. There's also some evidence that it may be dangerous for people who are considered not at risk, not high risk, but this is always difficult to tell because you don't know whether these people had some underlying conditions that were not diagnosed, right? The second thing that we learned is that actually social distancing, if it's strict enforced, really works, right? So there are vast numbers of people all over the world today who are under some sort of either partial or complete lockdown. We've seen, I think by now it's clear how with a little lag, this is actually leading to some reaction with that 2-week lag that I mentioned before, some reduction in cases. So we have been learning something, but it's true that knowledge is extremely limited. And I think for me, the part that is really most shocking is how little we know in terms of actual incidents, right? So and this is true, virtually every country in the world, maybe with the exception of Korea that really had widespread testing, or at least had more testing. We are still overall relying on number of cases. This number of cases are based on people with kind of serious conditions that got tested. Also in the vast majority of countries, including developed countries, we are relying on hospitalizations and deaths, right? This has like two implications in terms of knowledge of data, right, and what we can see. One is that we have a very imperfect picture of what's going on in real time, right? We just really don't know what is happening today in terms of the epidemiological dimension of the epidemics, right? What we know, and I mean what we understand reasonably well, is kind of what was happening 2 weeks ago, right? In terms of contamination and spread of the disease. So I think that's really the major gap in knowledge to policy making, to evidence-based policy making right now, right? On top of that, I think we know that there's no vaccine or prophylactic drug that is in sight and in the near future. There is no effective pharmacological treatment that is currently available, and just really clinical support seems to be effective, or at least, I mean, the only strong evidence that we have is that clinical support seems to have an effect. Pharmacological treatments, the ones that have been tested, and these, I mean, we've benefited from recent developments in artificial intelligence and machine learning, because there's like tens of drugs being tested that have been selected based on mostly on machine learning, trying to select drugs that we already use that are more likely to be adequate to fight the coronavirus. But despite that, actually, as I understand, there's no clear winner. There's no drug that really seems to be a breakthrough, right? So we still, there's nothing coming up on that. On the vaccine front, I think that what I understand as the established knowledge is that it's very unlikely that anything's going to happen before 12 to 18 months. And then there is a very high probability that we're going to have something in 12 to 18 months, right? The other final dimension on this point that I think is relevant, and even more relevant when you're talking about the future, is actually testing, right? So tests are actually becoming faster and more accurate, particularly more accurate, and particularly important within the road ahead is actually antibody testing, right? So this basically takes me to the last point I want to make that is related to the road ahead, right? So I think we inevitably have to start thinking about some sort of a transition from this complete lockdown to some type of normalcy, right? And in objective terms, I mean, what we have to consider is what the type of information that we need for that and how we would actually act upon this information, right? So I think the idea that the transition out of a complete lockdown is inevitable comes from the realization that actually the larger the complete lockdown lasts, the larger the permanent damage to economic structures is going to be, right? And this is going to make the recovery very, very difficult. So I think society can probably support this for 1, 2 months, maybe 3 or a little more in the extent that we have today. It's completely, I think, it's completely unrealistic to think that we actually can be in this level of shutdown over a year, for instance, because then actually food would start and then disappearing from the supermarket. People would start having really basic problems with day-to-day survival, right? So we do have to start thinking about very seriously, but the discussion politically has been framed, and even in the media, I think has been framed in very, very simplistic terms, right? So we have some people in favor of it, some people against it, and obviously that's not the way we do policy, or not, at least it shouldn't be the way we do policy, right? So I think, as I mentioned before, I think we must think about the objective conditions that would be required for a reasonably responsible return, even if partial, and try to figure out and try to monitor those conditions, right? And most obviously, I mean, just to get this out of the way, irrespective of whatever form this takes in the future, those people at higher risk, they have to be protected irrespectively of the way we transition. This may actually present challenges on its own when you have household structures that comprise several generations of the same family, for instance, which is common in poor areas of Latin America. But I'm going to leave that aside. I think that's kind of a practical consideration that if this problem came about, we would have to think how to do, what to do in relation to that. So I'm going to talk a little more just to close my initial considerations about the information that I think is essential to consider a responsible return to some sort of economic activity without a major increase in risks, right? Of course, all of this absent any major technological breakthrough and new drugs, right? Just considering what we have today for the next 12, 18 months until a vaccine comes about, right? So I think there are two things that we have to monitor to be able to actually do a transition in a minimally responsible way. One is actually the rhythm of continuing expansion of the virus. So what's happening geographically with the virus and what's the dynamic. Preferably, ideally, we would be able to, we would want to do it at the most disaggregated level possible. And the other one is like the degree of acquired immunity in society. Even though there are discussions of how long this is going to last, my understanding from reading the discussions is that infectiologists actually believe that there's going to be at least some temporary immunity acquired by exposure to the virus, probably at the very least, I mean, several months, let's say, right? Whether it goes more than that, we're really not sure. And these pieces of information are actually essential because they allow a movement from what's the general lockdown that we have today to some sort of more kind of decentralized lockdown, right? The idea that actually, obviously this policy that we have today is a very raw policy, right? It's not a very precise policy, it's not very focused, but it is what we can do with the amount of information that we have. But ideally, we would want to try to disaggregate this a little bit, right? And I mean disaggregate geographically. When I know that today there are several small cities in Brazil that actually have 0 cases, 0 recorded cases, 0 suspected cases, and are under lockdown. Obviously, this is a gigantic cost that if you were able to monitor these places in a weekly basis, probably could be made more flexible. But not only geographically, I mean, this more information would allow us to also decentralize the policy at the individual level, meaning people who have already been contaminated and acquired immunity would be able to go back to work, exposing other people to much, much lower risks, right? Obviously, I mean, this has been considered, I think it's being considered right now already in Italy and in other places, in Germany, if I'm not mistaken. It obviously also raises ethical issues. If this was to become something permanent, it would be a little strange to have people who are authorized to go around and other people who cannot. But actually, we think that this is likely to be a temporary stage, so it might be a very valuable tool when transitioning back to normalcy, right? So all of these actually point exactly in the same direction. That is just, I mean, the value of testing nowadays. I think in terms of return to normalcy, the big barrier is the lack of information, and the way to actually reduce this lack of information, to increase the access to information, is just testing. And I think, I mean, a major expansion in testing capacity would be really invaluable in terms of making the transition to the new normalcy, let's say, to make it responsible, right? So ideally, I think we would have random testing of large groups in the population, ideally in different areas, to understand the regional dynamics of the epidemic, and also widespread access to antibody testing so that people could be, some people at least, could be allowed to return to work. And along these 2 dimensions, we basically, I don't think we know very, very little, right? So the numbers in terms of actual incidence of the disease, they vary from, some people suggest that the actual number of cases is 8 times what we have even in developed countries. Other people suggest that it's actually like 60 or 100 times. So the level of ignorance is very large. So let me stop here, and already went over time, and thank you, Vicky, again for the opportunity of sharing these thoughts.
Thanks to you and to Pilar. I have been gathering questions in the chat. If anybody has questions, please write them in the chat section. I'm going to start asking the questions, but I wanted to start with one of my own. So Pilar talks about the PREDICT program, and what's interesting about the PREDICT program, who really was looking at coronaviruses, is that it was discontinued in September 2019. So this comes back to the issue that Rodrigo mentioned, that the certain particular political spirit in which the idea that science was useful was not perceived as such. But yet by September 2019, it's only a few months before actually 2 or 3 months before the start of coronavirus. So it's, I mean, I'm not sure that they had already caught it. I mean, I have no idea of the timing, but do you think that if that had not been discontinued, we would have been in a different place than we are now? So that's my question, I think, to Pilar, and then I guess I'll move to Rodrigo, and then we open to the rest of the questions.
Yeah. I don't, oh, do you hear me? So yeah. The PREDICT project is just one part of what we need to do to try to better understand and prepare for these things to happen and to prevent pandemics, basically. It's impossible. So what they were doing is monitoring the viruses that were circulating, not just coronaviruses, but other viruses that were circulating and had a probability to jump into humans. So that's part of the equation. The more we know about what is happening, the quicker we can have a response, because we know the sequence of the virus that are circulating, so we can start moving quicker into, okay, developing treatments or vaccines for this diseases. The idea is to know what is happening, what's circulating, and what is the disease that it's going to be the next pandemic for. There could have a probability of being the next pandemic. Now, that's not just with the PREDICT program. It's not enough. That's just one part of it. That's the surveillance we need to do on the wild reservoirs. The other, so we cannot predict exactly when the spillover events are going to happen. We can say, okay, they're circulating, these viruses are circulating and we can say the prevalence where they're circulating in reservoirs. We don't know when someone is actually going to get in contact with it. So for example, coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2 was just one spillover event, meaning there was just one contact from like a person with whatever the reservoir was that created that jump in the virus. There could be multiple events happening, multiple, for example, that was a discussion at the beginning in the wet market. It says different people getting exposed to one source, or there was like circulating in bats in that area, people were getting exposed, so there were multiple events where the virus jumped into people, or it's just one. With the evidence that we have now from the sequences, is we know that it was one event that happened in late November. But that's just one part of it. And the other part is how we prepare for this. And that's the political decision. So the fact that we need the surveillance program to go on, the problem is that they're really expensive. It's not just a trivial question of, okay, let's just go and sample. These are really expensive studies to maintain, and it's just not enough. We cannot just rely on this to say, okay, we're going to do this to prevent the pandemic. We need to do capacity building, which is preparedness, and how each country, for example, in areas where we know that there's likely to be an emerging event, how they're going to be able to prepare to do a very early on mitigation and can kind of contain it there and prevent this pandemic from happening.
Thank you. I have a bunch of questions, in particular dealing with the particular responses regarding the gathering of data and so prevention and responses. So for both of you, people have been asking if you see more cooperation among Latin American countries emerging after this event in terms of surveillance, or you don't see that happening. In particular for Rodrigo, there have been questions about how is the particular way in which governments deal with data, such as Brazil, where there has been this tension between the health minister and the president, and I have to add, and the governors as well. And the case of Mexico, another case where the data was ignored for very long. So if you could comment on those two cases, Rodrigo, there's a bunch of questions on that. And then, you know, on the capacity building and the costs that both of you have mentioned in the need to get granular data, both for prevention in the case of Pilar and for dealing with moving into more selective quarantines in the case of Rodrigo. Do you think the countries in the region have the money, the capacity to pay for doing this? I mean, at this point, what I'm seeing is, you know, lack of reactives for making even basic testing. And so how do you see these issues? I guess maybe Rodrigo first and then Pilar.
Okay. So in terms, I think in the case of Brazil, I think kind of illustrates very well this broader tension that we're talking about. I mean, it seems that, I think it's Tom that brought it here. It's like Columbia Grow Los Angeles. It seems that the tension between the president and the minister of health is over because he's not the minister of health anymore. But I mean, this was expected, and because of their last a few weeks, the relationship had deteriorated very much, right? And I think in the case of Brazil, obviously the marginal impact of the president saying the things that he is saying is very negative, but I think it is mostly negative at this stage. Actually, I think it's mostly negative because of the way it's actually undermining the efforts of the lockdown. So I think there's part of the population that, because of what the president is saying, are not taking it very, very seriously, and this definitely is extremely negative. But at the same time, what came out of this, I mean, it was an increased isolation of the president himself. Not only, I'm not saying the isolation of the executive. I mean, an isolation of the president himself, even inside the executive, right? And that's partly reflected on how several ministers, I mean, the handful of more technical ministers, meaning the Minister of Agriculture, the Minister of the Economy, and the Health Minister, actually giving, publicly contradicting the president in terms of recommendations several times, right? On top of that, there was a completely new dynamics in terms of federalism in Brazil. What the states are doing right now, and the way the states are taking the front, the front row in terms of initiatives of fighting epidemics and coordinating together and going to the Supreme Court to challenge the authority of the federal government to regulate whatever happens in terms of social distancing in the states, is something without precedent in as I understand, in Brazilian recent political history, at least. And they have won. They have won exactly because the president is very isolated. So I think for a long time there was this perception in the international media that Brazil was doing nothing because of the way that Bolsonaro was coming out about this issue. But it was actually mistaken. São Paulo actually took a lockdown measure more or less at the same time as New York. That was like, and in a much earlier stage. São Paulo finished its first field hospital before New York actually finished its first field hospital. And it's still far behind. The things that, obviously the influence of the president is extremely negative on that, but I think in some sense and I think that goes back to my initial motivation to this, the strength of the public health community in Brazil, and even the public health technocracy inside the Ministry of Health, inside the state secretariats of health, was strong enough to convince governors, to convince politicians that this was no joke, and to make them actually confront the president. So I think in the case of Brazil, this was very clear, and I'm overall, given the president being whom he is, I'm overall positively surprised by the response, exactly because people were able to confront him and to stop him. The Congress, the Supreme Court, and governors, and even part of his ministers as well. The point that I think actually Tom raised, whether the change in the Minister of Health is going to have a first order effect, I'm not sure. I didn't see the name of the appointed person. I read the profile of the 3-4 names that were floating around. I thought that they looked okay, because I think also he's under a lot of pressure. And I think he knows that he has to walk the line. I mean, by him, I mean the president, right? So hopefully, I mean, again, I don't know, I haven't seen the name, but hopefully it's not going to go very far. I think that also the relationship with the president and the minister was deteriorated to a point that it was clear that the minister would have to leave, even if he was doing a great job, which he actually was. So the Minister of Health in Brazil since early February have been talking about it and taking it very, very seriously. So I think I'm going to stop here to give some time to it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to get back to you, but I want to say, Rodrigo, that it's not just Brazil and it's not just federal countries. We see a similar dynamic in Chile, where the majors have sued the government to impose quarantines, to close schools. And we see also the Medical Association having a very, very important role also in suspending the plebiscite. So it's not a particular feature of A, having someone like Bolsonaro, or B, having a federal country, but we've seen it all over, in which people who are much more in close contact with their voters, I guess, are very, very concerned about the consequences. One question, I mean, I have two questions for you too. one that just came that I really want to make, and the other one on resources, which is a more difficult one. So someone has just asked for both of you, if you think that coronavirus and the experience of COVID-19 will change the way in which societies perceive the environmental agenda. I mean, this has been associated to deforestation and to, the points that Pilar making, to having the humans and the animals maybe too close together. So somebody asked for both of you, and maybe if you can briefly, so that we have time for other questions, answer, what do you think would be the impact on that?
So I think actually we're in a very tough spot right now, but I think there's some opportunities we can get out of the situation we're in. There's a lot of,
We're not listening to you, Pilar.
Oh, sorry. It's just, yeah. So, so I think we have some opportunities to actually coordinate the responses. And I think you asked that question before, and how can we coordinate? I mean, there has been we have experiences, for example, dealing with Chagas disease, where we have, in the Southern Cone countries, we had a huge project, which was the Southern Cone Initiative to control Chagas disease. And it was actually successful for the most part in reducing the transmission of Chagas disease intradomiciliary in most of the countries in South America. We still have some hotspots. So there are experiences of coordinated responses. We need to think about this as what are the challenges that we're facing in the region. I think there was a question about what markets. I think most of the countries, and particularly in South America, we have very strict rules on wildlife trafficking, but we have some challenges, which is the informal economy, which will create these opportunities for happening. And so I think what we really need to do, there's groups on the academic side of things in universities that are working on these problems. So we just need to coordinate those responses. And I think that coordination has to be facilitated by governments. And that will kind of take the weight off how expensive this program is if you want to start from scratch. There's a lot of has been done. We just need to capitalize on them.
Okay, so just on this point, I mean, I hope it is the case that actually there's going to be some return to credibility, let's say, of science and expertise and established knowledge. I think we have some evidence of that on the lack of erosion of political support for Bolsonaro that has been very clear in Brazil, and for Trump in the US more recently. At the same time, I'm not sure, because I mean, this political responses to these events, they tend to be, I think, very emotional in the medium run, right? And I mean, they can go in different directions. I also think that there's going to be probably a movement, an additional blowback in international integration, and as a result of this, and you may think, oh, but these things are not related, right? But I mean, they kind of are, because we have these political groups that are against integration that tend to be the same groups that actually are not very fond of knowledge and science. So I think I'm a little apprehensive. I hopefully something's going to come out of this, and we're going to go back to believing in knowledge and when making policy. But I'm not sure. I think it's difficult. It's very difficult to tell at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, and the other question that comes back to the issue of resources. So Rodrigo, you provide a kind of a great map of how to get this granular data about the population and the geography. But the issue for both of you is that resources are limited in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's very hard even to sustain the quarantines, given people living together in very close quarters, in shanty towns and slums. So what would be the appropriate policies for prevention and for dealing with this problem, this crisis, given the resources that we have in the region?
Do you hear me? Oh, yeah. So going back to that, there has been some talks about doing community quarantine. So basically you're isolating a municipality or have some restrictions in between municipalities. So depending on what the scale we want to do it at, for example, particularly in the case of like shanty towns, and those are particularly challenging. So we can think about differently in Latin America in that sense, which the scale we need to, at the one that we need to contain. And the same thing goes for intervention. So moving forward and trying to prevent these things from happening in the future and having more surveillance, you can think about doing it different scales. Not everything has to be vertical, top down from the national government to the more local governments. You can think about having different type of interventions and policy in state, because not all the regions are the same. Not all the regions, for example, wildlife trafficking or exposure to this zoonotic diseases. Again, going back to just really quickly to Chagas disease, we have some building capacity at the local level that have different degrees of success. But basically it was training local people to respond to the surveillance. So people would say, I have triatomines, which are the vectors for the disease, in my house, but the response, instead of coming and waiting for the national government or state government to go and spray their houses, they have a more local response. So that means that there has to be a lot of logistics and coordination involved. But I think that level of going back and forth and integrating across skills, I think that's the only way we can do it in Latin America.
Rodrigo?
Okay, so in terms of cost, I think that in terms of the testing, that's the thing that I concentrated a lot on, and lots of people have been talking about. I think actually the kind of the unitary cost of production of a test are reasonably low in comparison to the amount of money that governments are spending, right? The fact that the current capacity is limited. So this low cost works until a certain level, and above that level, there's not enough capacity worldwide, right? So there is an issue of expansion of capacity, and I think several governments are actually pushing for that. When I mentioned the costs are relatively low, I was thinking about the antibody tests, right? That I think relatively quick and actually relatively cheap when given the technology and the reagents and so on. Given these limitations, and I think capacity is being expanded as we speak and in several places of the world and so on. But I think the other thing, we have to take advantage of the things that we know from statistics, right? And we have to go, in terms of monitoring regions, we have to go with random sampling, right? And we have to look at different regions and to imagine in a city like Sao Paulo, to conduct 5,000 tests a week, it's cheap. I mean, it's really, really very cheap, right? If you have if you can monitor the public health system and understand that where people are coming from, and you look at these patterns, and based on that, you go and decide on some sort of more localized sampling of different populations to monitor the poor communities, to try to understand how different communities are evolving. You can then move to something like what Pilar said, that is like to understand that, well, here really it's a hot spot now. So we have to focus attention here, but in this other neighborhood, things have actually slowed down, right? So I think using a little bit of random sampling and with also taking advantage of the information that comes through the health system. And I think there are probably ways to maximize the use of these tests, even under the limited capacity that we have. As capacity expands, I think the actual cost is not that high, really, in terms of unitary tests, right? The unitary cost of tests, right?
So you think it's mostly an issue in both of you? The issue seems to have been state capacity at the end as being one of the problems, both for predicting what happens and also to deal with the crisis when it unfolded.
I think there is, very quickly, I think there is an issue of productive capacity in terms of tests, right? We don't have something set up to test hundreds of millions of people instantly, because in a typical situation, that's not necessary. Of course, now I think with these things becoming more common, I'm sure Pilar has more to say about that. I think we have to start thinking about setting up systems that can be activated and that actually would be able to deliver that much faster than now, because now I think it was disastrous, not only in developing countries, but also in the majority of the developed world, right? The exception of the Asian countries that also had some previous experiences with these other outbreaks, right?
Yeah, well, what's interesting about the Predict project, what is happening now, is that they're using that capacity that they built within the project with the local partners in Southeast Asia, Middle East, and Africa to use those facilities actually for testing right now. So it's not one thing or the other. You can think about, okay, how this people that I'm, like all this capacity building that I'm building in these places in terms of training people, having the equipment necessary to do this testing, how can it be used for multiple purposes? And my hope is that we're always chasing, and it's very evident in Latin America for everybody that comes from there, they're always running behind stuff instead of preparing forward. And so I'm hoping that this is going to create an opportunity to coordinate response, to create that capacity to prepare. So it's these two things, it's like surveillance and preparedness. So know what it's happening, and also in case if something happens, how prepared are you going to be? And those are not exclusive things, they're together.
Okay, I think we are getting to the end of the time. It's almost 4 p.m. I ask as many questions as possible from the chat. There's going to be a recording from this webinar in the webpage of ILAS. The webpage of ILAS also has a lot of resources on COVID-19 in Latin America. If you go there, there's a summary of what's going on, the responses of all countries, links to other resources. And starting next week, we will have blogs on the consequences of coronavirus, on politics, on contamination, on education, on migration, and many other areas from Columbia faculty. And I want to thank especially Pilar and Rodrigo for giving us their time as part of this effort of Columbia to try to highlight what's happening with COVID-19 in Latin America. And thanks to all of you for having attended and asked questions. Goodbye to everyone. This is Vicky Murillo, the director of the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University. Thank you.